Hi, my name is John Goodman, and we are talking today about production builder contracts. This is not a builder contract, for example, that a lot owner would sign with a builder who is building a house on a lot that is owned by the owner of the lot. No, what we're talking about is a production builder who typically develops a residential subdivision, maybe a townhome, maybe a condominium, and they are building something on it in anticipation of having a closing where the land and the improvements on the land, the house, are conveyed to a buyer. And we're talking about some features of those contracts. Now, let me say two conceptual things before we get into the details of this. Two conceptual things about these contracts. Number one is I represent a lot of builders. I also work with a lot of buyers who enter into these contracts. And notwithstanding the problems with these contracts from a buyer's perspective, most builders behave more honorably than their contracts require them to do so. And part of that is because they are more honorable, but part of it is that regardless of how the contract read, there's a certain kind of integrity that is imposed on all of us by the marketplace. The second thing that I want to say about these contracts is I'll relate a quick anecdote for you, but I can remember representing a buyer who was entering into one of these contracts, and I was having a conversation with a vice president of a national home builder, and as we were talking about this and that feature of it, I said to this gentleman, this vice president, I said, if you were a buyer, you would never sign a contract that read like this. And his response was, you know what, you're right, John. If I was a buyer, I wouldn't sign a contract like this. It's a very builder-oriented contract. He admitted that. He said, however, John, the problem that your buyer has is that there's 4 other buyers who are in line right behind your buyer who are more than happy to sign that contract. And so that's another reality that we face. As I'm recording this right now, at least in the market that I'm in the Front Range of Colorado, the Denver metro area, let's say, there is a phenomenon where there is a tremendous shortage of inventory for buyers to purchase, and sellers have more clout. So it's good to be aware of problems with these contracts to have reasonable expectations, but that doesn't mean you can do big things with that. Having said that, when I finish this video, I'll tell you what we were able to do for our buyer client, even in that transaction where the vice president for the national home builder said what he said, that there were 4 other buyers lined up. I'll create a little drama, save that for the end. Okay, so what are some common problems with these contracts? One common problem from a buyer's perspective with these contracts is, though the contract might have a contingency in it, for example, excusing the buyer from closing if the buyer doesn't get financing, the buyer was still likely obligated to forfeit, at the very least, their upgrade deposits. And in some ways that works in unfairness to the buyer because the builder gets the benefit of the upgrade deposits and the upgrades that the buyer paid for it. Now, trust me, I represent builders, and there's a response that there may be a buyer, for example, who upgraded to add the enhanced landscaping package. And while the enhanced landscaping package might add on $10,000 of value to this particular buyer, it may not add on $10,000 of value to the marketplace. And that's the rationale for the builder getting to keep both the upgrade deposit plus the upgrade itself. Another issue with these contracts is that they almost never commit to a firm closing date, and we understand why. The builder doesn't know exactly when the house is completed, but the builder also wants to close as soon as the house is completed. So the contracts typically provide that once the house is substantially complete, then the builder is able to call for a closing within a relatively short period of time, and the buyer is obligated to close. If the contracts have a date requiring the builder to close by any date, that date is often 12 months out, sometimes 18 months out, and even that date can be extended by what lawyers call a force majeure clause, that allows the builder to extend the closing date for things like fires and floods and labor shortages and strikes, etc. So if the buyer is going into this with eyes wide open, then they can deal with the uncertainty about when the closing is. But it's just important for buyers to have their eyes wide open, that the on-site salespeople may be saying the house is going to be complete in 5-6 months. The buyer can't count on closing for 8 months, 10 months, a year, and the buyer needs to make decisions accordingly about terminating their existing lease or selling their existing property, etc. Another thing to be mindful of is some buyers find it problematic not just to be delayed. Other buyers might find it problematic to be obligated to close too early. The on-site salespeople might be telling you you don't need to close for 5 months, and the house might be ready in 3 months, which can create mischief for some buyers. Another issue is typically these contracts call for a closing when the home is substantially complete, and oftentimes that is defined by when the builder has any kind of certificate of occupancy on the property, even a temporary certificate of occupancy. Few problematic things about that from the buyer's perspective. One is that once the buyer closes, once the builder has substantially all, if not all, of the buyer's funds, all of a sudden the incentives change, and the builder has less of an incentive to keep the buyer happy because the builder has the buyer's money. And as other things come up on the construction project, for example, the building of other houses, resources might get devoted to completing other houses rather than completing what we call the punch list items, the post-closing follow-up items that the builder has on the subject property. Another issue is that just because the county or the city issues a certificate of occupancy that says that the house is livable, that does not mean that the house has been built in the way that your buyer expects. Another problem is that there isn't typically provisions that call for some of the seller's proceeds, some of the money that the buyer is paying for the property, to be escrowed to secure the seller's obligation to complete these punch list items post-closing. One last thing that I'll mention is that many builder contracts, not all, but many builder contracts provide that if the builder defaults, the buyer's sole remedy is to terminate the contract and get the buyer's earnest money back. Now, being able to get out of the contract and getting the earnest money back is better than nothing, okay? However, it doesn't help a buyer in an appreciating market. You might have helped a buyer put a property under contract, say, at $350,000. In the time frame in the 4, 5, 6 months while it's being built, the market may have appreciated enough so that now that builder is getting offers on that property or models like it, not for $350,000, but for, let's say, $380,000, $390,000. In those scenarios, the builder has much less incentive to honor the contract, keep your buyer happy, build things the way your buyer wants. The builder has less incentive to monitor things. Stuff happens on the job, things get sloughed, and all of a sudden it's not the house that your buyer was expecting. If the builder if the builder is breached, for example, by not building the house that your buyer wants, and your buyer terminates and gets your earnest money back, again, it's not horrible, except that the buyer has to go back out in the market, try and find a replacement home that now might cost that buyer the $380,000 to $390,000. In an appreciating market, a remedy for a buyer of termination and getting the buyer's earnest money and upgrade deposits back is not that meaningful a remedy. Okay, that takes me back to the question I posed at the beginning of this. Remember that conversation I was having with the vice president of the National Home Builder, and remember what he said is, you're right, John, I would not sign such a contract, but the problem your buyer has is that there are 4 other buyers lined up behind your buyer, John, who will sign such a contract. But this is what he went on to say. I'll tell you what, though, we're so confident of an appreciating market that we will put a provision in this contract. We will add an additional provision in this contract that says, if the buyer gives us notice, not less than 2 weeks prior to closing, that the buyer wants to terminate, we will refund all of the buyer's earnest money plus half of their upgrade deposits. Now, that solution doesn't cure all sins. It doesn't help the buyer in an appreciating market, but it cures a lot of problems with these contracts. And I ask you to keep that in mind, not necessarily for you to write on your own. A lot of the people who are watching these videos are real estate brokers. And even in states like Colorado, where real estate brokers have a fair amount of leeway to add provisions into contracts, they probably cannot do so in builder contracts. Most of you work in states, most of you as brokers work in states where lawyers need to be much more involved in the residential real estate transaction than in a state like Colorado. But an idea is, and a reason for a buyer to be enthusiastic about getting a little help from a lawyer is, a clause like that in a contract can go a long way. Let me finish with my usual disclaimer, which is that I am a lawyer who is licensed to practice law only in the state of Colorado. What I am saying here is general information. It's not intended as legal advice to anybody, but it's especially not intended as legal advice if you are watching this and you work on real estate transactions in some state out of the state of Colorado. Your buyers, for example, with this video, should consult a lawyer who's licensed in your state. And as always, remember, we live in a complicated world. Be careful out there. Thanks for listening.